God King, A Story in the Days of King Hezekiah by Joanne Williamson. Chapter 2, Death of a God. Taharka thought he could count on his fingers the number of times he had seen his father, though he sometimes felt his eyes upon him, heard something almost like a chuckle as the awesome figure passed him in its gold-washed litter, borne on the backs of 4 strong men. The god had many wives and a great many children. Some were important because their mothers were princesses. Taharka's mother was not, though of course the priests had made her one when the god had chosen her. She was just a girl who had been brought with the other slaves and a cargo of gold up from the far-off Zambezi River. She had died some years before, and Mbuta, her brother, was all that Taharka had left of her. So Taharka was not one of the important children of the god, but they all played together and learned together in the women's quarters, learned reading and writing, languages and dancing, magic and healing, and the many laws and taboos of Cush, and above all, the lore of the gods, their cousins. Today, Taharka was not taken back to the house of the women. Just as he was, looking like a boatman's boy, he was brought into the god's great chamber to see his father die. The sweat on his face was cold now as he joined the throng of children, brothers, sisters, cousins of all degrees, some of them shivering with fear, some giggling softly in nervous excitement. His cousin, Shepneset, was there, bad little Shepneset, who had stolen a lamb from the kitchen. They had been keeping a close watch on her since the day another cousin, whose mind had not grown with his body, had reached out smiling to touch a poisonous asp. Shepneset, attacking the creature with a stick, had almost gotten herself killed. That would have been a disaster, for Shepneset was the niece and destined heir of Taharka's great aunt, the high priestess of Ammon, who ruled as the god's deputy for Egypt in far-off Thebes. She would one day be almost more sacred than the king himself. Taharka liked to look at her. Even today he could not help looking at her, though the other children whispered that she was really not that pretty. It was on that day of the killing of the asp that he had decided that marriage might not be so bad after all. Of course, there was no question of his marrying Shepneset. She was destined for his half-brother, Sabataka. That, he thought, was as it should be. Sabataka, 16 years old, tall, strong, grave, and handsome. After today, the god. There was no doubt about that. The priests had prepared for it for years. Only Shabataka could really be said to know his father. Only Shabataka was allowed to slip into his presence unannounced. Only Shabataka could stand at his side, listening and learning, while the Lord of Cush gave audience. Taharka's reverence for his older brother was second only to his reverence for the god himself. What must Shabataka be feeling now, he wondered. Grief, certainly. The god himself was not seated on the golden stool, as Taharka had always seen him before. His cedarwood couch had been carried into the great hall. He lay upon it, propped up on cushions, his breath faint, his clouded eyes wandering over the faces of the priests and magicians and captains and the many wives and children. Why are they here, he whispered. Must I give a judgment? The priest of Sebek the crocodile was on his knees beside the couch. Yes, a judgment, great God. The time has come. You must take the wand of succession in your hand. You must declare your choice. My sons, said the god Shabaka, bring them to me. Pai Anki, Sabataka, Kashta, Taharka. Taharka, no, said the crocodile priest. He raised his head from the ground and spoke so all could hear him. The Lord Taharka has broken a taboo. He has touched the flesh of a slave. His godhead is sullied. We will pass judgment on him later. Taharka could not have moved. They knew. How had they known so quickly? It didn't matter. They knew. The god was speaking. His voice was stronger. We will pass judgment. I am the god on earth. I will pass judgment. Taharka, my son, seed of my father, Payanki, seed of my father, Kashta, the king, come to me. On his knees and elbows, Taharka crawled the length of the stone floor to his father's couch. The god's voice was weaker now. Why have you done this thing? Taharka raised his head. The man would have died, he whispered. Though it was forbidden to look into the god's eyes, Taharka knew that, through the mist of weakness and pain, they were as hard as the black rod of the holy mountain. In terror, he searched for words that the god would understand. Suddenly he found them. He straightened on his knees, and his voice rang out as firmly as the voice of the priest of Sebek. The man belonged to the god. Everything belongs to the god. The water of the river, the grain in the fields, the laborers, the priests and chieftains of the land. I, too, am a slave of the god. I must preserve what belongs to you, great god Shabaka. The great god Shabaka fell back upon his cushion. A groan of dismay ran around the great chamber. If the dying man had used up his strength on this trifling matter, what would become of the succession? Would the land be left without a god on earth to bring the rising of the sun and the flooding of the river and the growth of the grain? But the god had raised a trembling hand. The priest of the sun in Naphtah hastened to place within it the wand of gold, the magic wand of succession, the scepter of gold. The wand wavered a moment, and then it fell. Its tip pointed toward the boy kneeling beside the couch. There was a long moment's silence. The figure on the couch did not move. At last the priest of the sun broke the silence. The great God, he said, has become one with his Father. See the wand of succession. It has declared his choice. The priests, the warriors, the many wives and children fell upon their knees, their foreheads pressed to the cold floor of the chamber. Taharka heard again the voice of the sun priest. Taharka, child of the god, rise. He was trembling. What did it mean? What had happened? Was he to be punished now? His hands were being crossed upon his breast. Something cold and smooth was pressed into them. It was the golden wand of the god. Take possession of the land, Taharka, soul of the hawk, beautiful child of Ra, son of the sun, bringer of the Nile, lord of Cush, great god of Naphtah, and Meroe and Pharaoh of Egypt. Taharka had become a god. He had also received his punishment. Chapter 3. Shabbataka. The punishment was this. Taharka, the Cushite boy, was now all those things that the priest of the sun had called him. He was king of a land that stretched from the mouth of the Nile on the northern sea, someday to be known as the Mediterranean Sea, to the southern border of Cush. He was immensely rich. He owned copper mines in the Sinai Desert, gold mines in the highlands of Ethiopia and jungles of Zimbabwe. He owned every inch of farmland and forest land, every wild beast, every goat and sheep and cow. He also owned every man, woman, and child, and every fruit of their labor, for he was the God on earth. As the God, he had many duties. He must be up before the sun and in his golden chair, carried by 4 porters around the walls of the great house. For if he were not there, the sun would not rise at all. He must be on his golden stool before the sun was high, to receive the gifts of foreign princes and tribal chiefs, which were then shut away somewhere, for he would probably never see them again. There were the judgments, and this he hated most of all, for the sun priest had already decided them, and cruel as they might be, he was expected to pronounce them. After a while, he let the sun priest make the pronouncements himself. The sun priest raised no objections. And there were the taboos. Now that he was a god, so many things were forbidden him. He could eat no meat but the flesh of a calf or a goose, and only flat bread made without yeast. Only at certain hours of the day or at festivals was he allowed outside the walls of the great house. And then his head must be covered by the double crown, and his feet must not touch the ground. The day of the crocodile hunt, the sun on his skin, the mud on his feet, began to seem like a wonderful, impossible dream. Taharka had become a prisoner who must not even dream of escape. For if any of the taboos were broken, he knew that disaster would come upon the people. The sun would not rise in the morning, the river would not rise, and all the land would dry up and wither away. He was very lonely. Those who spoke to him must kneel, their faces to the ground. For it was believed that the sight of the Pharaoh's radiant face would strike a man blind. For that matter, not many people were allowed to speak to him at all. Of course, there was Shepneset, the untouchable Shepneset, little princess, high and mighty, the other children sneered, was now his betrothed wife. This was the law. If the wand had pointed to a beggar boy, that boy would have become the god, and he would have had to marry Shepneset. This at first seemed the strangest thing of all. At first he had hardly dared to speak to her. What would he say? The first thing she said to him was, "Are you hungry?" And forgetting his shyness for a moment, he answered her, "I'm starving." She dumped a handful of dates into his lap. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to eat them, but he did. From then on, talking to Shepneset was no more a problem than it had ever been. Shepneset loved to talk about her lessons and how to get out of them, about the tattoos and how to get around them, taboos, about food. Sometimes he thought he would have starved to death if it hadn't been for Shepnu. Sometimes she talked about the future. "I'll hate it," she said, as they sat together by the pool in the courtyard. She had smuggled in some of the honey cakes made from the unleavened dough. She had wanted to bring the forbidden ones, but Taharka hadn't dared to go that far. "Hate what?" said Taharka. "Everything about it," said Shepnu. "Living in Egypt, being shut up all day in that temple in Thebes. I'll be like you then, Harry, only worse. They'll make me give oracles. You know what that means." Taharka didn't answer. She had told him before. She told him again. "They'll make me breathe poppy smoke. I'll go out of my head and say stupid things, and they'll say it is the god Amon talking." "Well, won't it be?" said Taharka to annoy her. He succeeded. "What a baby! They can make you believe anything." He laughed. Shepnu looked at him sideways. Her voice softened. Besides, you won't be there. Taharka's heart quickened a little. He could not marry Shepnu till he was 16, but he often thought about it, and not just because his name would not be inscribed as king till that day came. He had decided that Shepnuset really was pretty, whatever the other children said. Your aunt will probably live a long time, he said, and even after they take you away, they'll have to let me visit you. His eyes brightened. I'll like that. Down the river to Thebes, Egypt. What a journey. They say it takes 30 days. Shepnuset was always practical. They won't let you go till you have chosen your companion. Have you done it? Yes. It will be Shabbataka, who should have been the god, who had listened while his father gave audiences and pronounced judgments, who knew all the rituals that Taharka was learning so painfully. Shepnuset looked around troubled. Why? Wondered Taharka. The companion of the god was closest of all to the king, almost, in fact, his double. In recent years, he had come to perform all those things that the priests had decided the pharaoh must not do. He led the armies to the front, and when the pharaoh must journey to the north, he remained behind to perform all the duties of the god. Yes, it would be Shabbataka, the cleverest and most capable of them all. Shabbataka, who had stood so still, his face so unreadable on the day of the great mistake. Shabbataka, who should have been the god. About a week after the mistake, he had come into Taharka's presence, on his feet and smiling, right up into his brother's face. No, no, my brother, Taharka had cried out, afraid for a moment that the handsome youth would be struck blind before his eyes. What are you afraid of, Harry? You have broken the taboo. So have you, brother. Have you been punished? Seeing that Shabbataka's eyes were as bright and sharp as ever, Taharka's fears were calmed. He was not, after all, the baby Shepnu had always thought him. Besides, the gods knew who should be king and who should not. I've been punished, he said. They've put me in a cage. Shabbataka looked around at the sandstone columns and the cedar wood stools and the couches inlaid with gold, all the things that belonged to Taharka. This is the cage? Being a god is a punishment? All this, and in a little while, to choose all the wives you want and any wife you want? The priest will turn her into a princess for you. He's thinking of my mother, thought Taharka. Shabbataka himself was the son of a real princess, a princess of the proud Somalis in Punt. But no one, not even Shabbataka, would ever make him ashamed of his mother. He did not have to force the royal frown that he leveled at his half-brother. But Shabbataka began to make a habit of coming to the room with the lotus pool. He didn't say much at first. He just sat there listening to what Taharka had to say, always watching. It made Taharka a little uncomfortable, as if his brother were listening for something behind his words, something that Taharka himself did not know was there. But after a while, he seemed to relax, to forget whatever it was he was listening for. Sometimes he almost chuckled. No, you don't obey the sun priest. He obeys you. And when old lady Memnet drops her comb in your presence, you don't go over and pick it up for her. She has a bad back. She shouldn't bend over. Ah, that's the doctor talking, but you're not a doctor, brother. You're the god. For a moment, the old shadow darkened his eyes. For some reason, in spite of the heat, Taharka felt a chill. Shabbataka often told him he did not know how to be the god. The judgments, for instance. You should decide them, not the sun priest. I don't like to judge people. Who knows? There may be reasons for the things they do. Yes, you and the vizier. He is as soft as you are. I was taught differently. He stopped. Taharka knew what he had been about to say. It was strange, but they had never seemed to mention their father. Something seemed to hold them back. But he had begun to take Shabbataka's advice about some things. The sun priest, for instance. There was a day the farmer was sentenced to lose his hand for striking the tax collector. No, said Taharka. There was a buzz of surprise, and the sun priest looked annoyed, as if a fly had stung him. The judgment has been given, great God. I have not given it. It was as if his father, the god, had spoken, not little Taharka, the son of the Bantu slave girl. For the first time in his life, he felt the thrill of power. The man says he has already paid his tribute. He says the agent was assessing him double. You haven't proved he was lying. The case is dismissed. He closed his eyes, waiting for the roar of protest. He would not have been surprised if they had simply ignored the interruption. But nothing happened. The man was hustled out of the hall, never looking back. He might have thanked me, thought Taharka. The scribes and officials bowed their heads in submission. Only a dark glint in the eyes of the sun priest offered a hint that something different was happening, that something had gone wrong. And that evening, Shabbataka said to him, That's not what I meant. You said the judgments should come from me. Shabbataka opened his mouth and then closed it. He shook his head. His eyes flickered back to the checkered board. They had been playing draughts. Shabbataka liked to gamble. Shabbataka always won. He had won everything that day. Taharka's gold rings, his ivory inlaid hounds and jackal's board, his dagger with the iron blade. Taharka had nothing left to bet. The cobra, said Shabbataka. He was smiling. There was something strange about his smile. Taharka stared at him. For a moment he thought he had misunderstood. The cobra, the coiled gold cobra, worn on the god's brow at ceremonies, the most sacred symbol of his godhood? Shabbataka was watching him, still with that strange smile. You wouldn't dare, his eyes were saying. All right, said Taharka, I'll do it. For the first time, Shabbataka's smile slipped. Taharka went a little crazy. Why not? I don't want it. If you want it, take it. It was meant for you anyway. You mean it, said Shabbataka softly. You'd do it? Yes, I would, said Taharka. I want. What did he want? To do as he pleased when he pleased to do it, to wrestle again with his brothers and cousins. He thought of that day on the river and the man with the gash in his arm, the wonderful feeling of satisfaction as the terrible bleeding stopped. Yes, he would like to learn more about that. He would like to study. He would like to work. I don't want to be a prisoner. Be quiet. There was a dangerous glitter in the older boy's eyes. Listen, Hari, I would have given my my soul, to have been chosen that day. Don't talk to me any more of prisons. You would give your never to go boating on the Nile, or to drive a horse, or to speak to anyone who isn't crawling like a beetle? Let them try to stop me from driving a chariot. Let them try to stop me from anything. And, he added softly, I would like to see some of them crawl. He paused a moment, his eyes looking far off. I would let other nations know that there is a God in Egypt. Even the Assyrians would know. The Assyrians? Who were the Assyrians? But then Shabbataka laughed and poked his brother's shoulder with his fist. Don't worry, I'm not the God. You are, so I'll teach you how to be one. Taharka no longer feared that his radiant face might blind anyone. He often tried to make Mbuta stand or sit in his presence, but his uncle would no longer do so. The forbidden things are forbidden things, he said. You are the God. I owe you respect. With Shabbataka's encouragement, Taharka had begun his weapons training again. Mbuta knelt beside him while he ran in place or lifted the weights or hurled the spear at the wooden target. And sometimes Mbuta did spring to his feet to correct him in his stance or in his grasp of his weapon. And then when the practice was over and Taharka sat by the pool wiping off the sweat, Mbuta still sometimes told him stories. Tell me about how we became the lords of Egypt. You can read it for yourself on the great stone when they take you to the temple. But I like to hear you tell it. And Mbuta would tell it again. He himself could not read, but he loved the story, and he had had it repeated until he knew it by heart. In the days of Kashta, king of Cush, Egypt, our neighbor to the north, had fallen on evil days. There was no more Egypt. Desert tribes ruled it piece by piece and laughed at the gods and sent bands of thieves to rob the tombs of their holy treasures. There was famine, for these barbarians knew nothing about watering the land of the Nile, and all the fields were drying up into desert. So messengers from Thebes came south to Cush and knelt before the Cushite king and swore their allegiance and begged for his help. They set the white crown of the Egyptian southland upon his head, and he began to restore their land. But the northland, where the great river spreads out into fingers and flows into the sea, suffered still. Then great Kashta died, and one day a courier came to his son, Pi Anki, your father's father, on this very roof where you are sitting now. Great one, he said, fearful news. A barbarian chief from the great northern sea has sailed south with many men and horses, and is laying waste to the villages of Egypt. He has dared to call himself Pharaoh. Your father's father, Pi Anki, sprang to his feet in terrible anger. By the hawk and the crocodile, and by the son whose son I am, the white crown of Egypt is mine as it was my father's. And now I will utterly destroy this barbarian. I will have the red crown too, and the crown of the north. Egypt will be one, and I will have it all. How the soldiers cheered him, crying, It is thy name that gives us strength. Thy bread is in our bellies, thy beer quenches our thirst. It is thy valor that gives us might, and there is strength in thy very name. So Pi Anki sailed north in the royal barge, and the riverbanks on either side were black with soldiers marching. Great Thebes thronged to him, weeping for joy. Into the very strongholds of the north he sailed. The people welcomed him and drove out the pale-skinned barbarian, and Egypt was one again. And your father set the double crown, the white and the red, upon his head, and surveyed the land as far as the great northern sea. And he wept at the ruin the barbarian had caused. And what angered him the most was that the horses had not been well tended. Mbuta sighed and wiped his forehead from the excitement of the story. Taharka sighed too, but he was thinking. Something was troubling him. "Uncle," he said, "was it really Pi Enki, the great one, who did all that, not a companion?" "By my honor, it was your father's father himself. He chose his son, your father's brother, who died later, to share his crown and remain in Napata. I was only a boy, but I remember it well." Taharka thought about this, balancing the wooden spear. So a companion could work both ways. He could stay at home and perform the rites while the god put himself in peril, if he chose to do so. And of course, a real king, a great king like Pi Enki, would choose to do so. He was not sure he liked the idea. He knew something about war. There were always the desert uprisings and invasions. He and the other royal students had once been taken to a place where wounded soldiers lay as a lesson in anatomy. He had never forgotten it. Yes, there had been wars, and there would be others. And, "Uncle," he said, "who are the Assyrians?" And Buta looked at him sharply. "So you have heard the name." He had heard more than just the name that Sabataka had mentioned. Even here in Kush, people whispered about the Assyrians. They always seemed to whisper. A strange and alien people, far, far away, lurking in distant mountains on the edge of the world, like shadowy beasts of prey in a child's bad dream, reaching out with long, strong arms to grasp and crush all around them. "The Assyrians are a cloud, nephew," said Mbuta, "a far-off cloud." A cloud? Taharka felt a little relieved. That wasn't so bad. A cloud wasn't real. "Ambassadors once came here to Napata to ask your father for help against the Assyrians," said Mbuta, "from the kingdom of Israel, way up north to the east. What with the desert tribes in the west and all that was to be done at home, your father had none to give." He added thoughtfully, "Israel hasn't been heard from since." That wasn't so good. Israel was a real place. That made the Assyrians seem more real. He thought of the stories he had heard. "They take people away," he said, and found that he was whispering too. "Just take them away, and they are never heard of again?" Shabataka told me that. He was trying to frighten me, but he said he thought it was a good idea. He said he thought they had a lot of good ideas. "I'm sure he did," said Mbuta grimly. "They take them away, all of them, with ropes around their necks. Like what happened to you and my mother." There was a silence. Mbuta had often told him the story of what happened to him and his little sister, Taharka's mother. It was a terrible story, how the soldiers of Kush had come to the market town on the far-off Zambezi River, how he, a young man, and his sister, a child, had been loaded onto one of their great sailing boats to be brought back up the coast to Punt and the inland to Kush to be sold into the army, and she to be sold into a wealthy family that would one day be brought to the attention of the god. But that story had had a happy ending. He wondered how many happy endings there were in the stories of people who had anything to do with the Assyrians. Shepneset's aunt, the high priestess in Thebes, died sooner than was expected. She had to be replaced at once. Taharka, stunned, was faced with the loss of his closest, almost his only companion, and something more, though he wasn't quite sure what it was. Lately it had frightened him a little, but not since his mother's death had he felt such a sense of loss. Shepneset, as always, tried to be brave. "After all, Harry, this means that you really will come to Thebes when you're 16. You'll have to. And you'll make the great journey, see all the sights. Only 4 years, Harry." She began to cry again, and Taharka said, 4 years? He couldn't see into that unimaginable future. Another blow followed soon. It was Mbuta's fault. Shabataka came into the room with the lotus pool while Taharka was exercising with his uncle. He came in as usual, boldly on his feet, and Mbuta forgot himself in his anger and ordered the haughty son of a god to his knees, as if he had been an insolent servant. Shabataka's eyes flashed lightning. "Slave, filth from the jungle, you backwoods Bantu, I am forbidden to soil my hands with you, but I will send a slave with your punishment." "Brother!" For the first time in his life, Taharka felt a terrible anger. Mbuta is the uncle of the god. No one but the god will dare punish him. "Do you think that you are the god?" For a moment, the lightning flashed upon Taharka himself. It was as if Shabataka were indeed the god, that the terrible light would blind the pretender. Then the light was hidden. Shabataka fell to his knees and crawled backward from the room with the lotus pool. Now Taharka's anger turned upon Mbuta. "Why did you do that? Shepnu is gone. Shabataka is all I have left, and now I no longer have him." Great God, my little nephew," cried Mbuta, his own head carefully bent. If it were right and safe to face the god as an equal, would I have not done it long ago? Safe for whom? Has Shabbataka been blinded? Have you been blinded? Safe for you, my Lord God, safe for you. The words broke from Embuta as if against his will. The great God is the great God because he is the great God. But what will become of him when he is no longer feared? Taharka slumped on the stone seat. This child of the god, Shabbataka, said Embuta softly, this son of a Somali princess, he does not fear anything. Make him fear you, nephew. Make him fear you if what? If you want to go on being alive. For a moment, Taharka remembered the shadow in Shabbataka's eyes. He put it out of his mind. Shabbataka was his brother. Shabbataka no longer came to the room with the lotus pool, and whenever Taharka passed him by, he was down on the floor in an instant. Taharka could no longer see what was in his eyes. But on the day of the rising of the Nile, most sacred day of all, when Taharka sat in solemn state high above the river in his sacred chair to bless the sacrifice, on this most sacred day, Shabbataka, in the throng of princes, raised his eyes to his and nodded. Taharka, acknowledging the look as best he could, felt his heart swell with relief. Shabbataka was still his brother. Chapter 4.